Okay, I welcome you to another episode of Learning Stories. This is an audio and video show where we interview a diverse set of learners from the 21st century. On each episode of this show, we interview a guest who has a story to share about how they acquired a set of skills and knowledge in a creative and innovative manner. In the process, we hope to uncover a new understanding of learning, as conceptualized, imagined, and narrated by our guest. Over time, I've realized that one of the most important reasons I started this podcast was to sort of contribute to a kinder and more empathetic form of the internet, where we hold space for each other and where we slowly start to appreciate the years of effort, sacrifice, learning, and love that it really takes to build a career in any field. So today I'm really excited to talk to someone who I met briefly, but who I feel I've known because of their writing. And I first came across Vikram Shah's writing on Substack. And without meeting him in person, I think we met in person just once. I've just found so much joy from his writing on topics like travel. He writes great fiction. I've particularly enjoyed his sports pieces. So, a little bit about Vikram before we jump into this conversation. So, Vikram Shah is an independent editor and writer. He has previously worked as an associate editor at narrative journalism magazine 52, as a copy editor at Mint Lounge, and as a commercial lawyer at the firm Herbert Smith Freehills Kramer. He has co-researched and co-written a non-fiction podcast called Barefoot Boys about the football club Mohun Bagan's unlikely win in a colonial football tournament. One of his short stories, Kukri, has been published in Mint Lounge. Another is forthcoming in an anthology published by the administrators of the Deodar Prize for Short Fiction. So, Vikram, it's such an interesting background. I feel like you've done and wet your feet in so many different fields. So, there are lots of questions I wanted to ask you, but we normally start this podcast off with a more open-ended first question where we ask the guest to tell us stories from their childhood. Where did you grow up? What school did you go to? What did your parents do? And what were you curious about outside school? What was the Vikram like growing up in school? And what did Vikram do outside school at that time? So go ahead, Vikram.
Wow, very interesting question. First of all, thank you so much for having me on this show, Abhishek. I've watched a couple of episodes of people whose writing that I knew before, and to hear them speak about their own journeys and the kind of questions that you ask them to sort of get them in a space where they talk so articulately about their journeys and about their writing has been just a delight to listen to, and so much of it sort of feels contextualized now. And it was lovely to meet you the other day at the Substack meet. And thank you so much. I've seen like the kind of people that you've gotten on your show before, and I feel really honored and quite chuffed actually that you asked me. So thank you for that. Um, to answer your question, childhood for me was a pretty, I would say it was a pretty happy childhood. I'm an only child, and I feel like a lot of I didn't think about this much before. It's only now that I've started thinking about my being an only child as such a big factor in me turning out in me turning out the way I have. Um, and I think that happens maybe as you grow older. And these are conversations that I've been having with other only children also now, right? Um, I grew up in Mumbai, in the western suburbs in Mumbai. My parents are doctors, so they've both been working uh, for as long as I can remember. And so I think in my childhood, I had a lot of time to myself, and not in the way that I was neglected. Not at all. My parents were very hands on, and are in fact even now. But just I had time to think about what was happening in my life as a child. And again, this is something that I'm only able to articulate now when there is distance from those years, and then you read things and you hear things. Um, so what did I enjoy? as a child outside school. So I was a pretty nerdy child. I did pretty well at school, and academics was very important, and it was important for me to be doing well at academics. It was a big part of my self identity also, I think, as a child. It is for many children. So I don't think there's anything unique in that aspect. Uh, but it took me then some time to actually shed that as part of my self identity. I think in the growing up years, long after my childhood, and even when I became an adult, I kind of carried some of that into adulthood. And then I realized that that was not the most healthy thing to do. Um, but that was, I think, the main sort of thing that I would describe myself as a good student. But I think I was curious about a lot of things. I was curious about outside school. I'd love. So in school, I loved social sciences. I loved like history and geography, and that kind of spilled outside school into an interest for different places, for learning about like different places and different things. I used to like pore over the atlas, for instance. A party trick of mine was, and I think this is a party trick for quite a few kids who are into the social sciences, is knowing capitals of different countries, and like the names of rivers and mountains and lakes, that kind of thing. But I also used to watch a lot of this stuff on television. I used to seek out like programming that spoke to people going to unfamiliar and different places and then discovering what those places are about. Uh, which is why Anthony Bourdain and sort of his shows came into my life pretty early. I think when I was in fifth or sixth grade, I'd started watching. I think No Reservations was the first show, and then there was Parts Unknown. Um, and I think he was one of those figures that I kind of looked up to and went like, "Wow, is it even possible to live like this? Like, does he actually do this for a living?" And I just loved his kind of curiosity towards life and people and places, and also, and again, this is something that I realized later on watching reruns and stuff, is he allowed himself to be vulnerable on camera, and and there was a kind of originality to the things that, even it didn't feel like it was being, someone handed him a script, like CNN just handed him a script and he was reading off it. I just liked that he probably wrote the stuff himself, and he did. um, and it and he delivered it beautifully on camera, so it didn't feel off piste in the sense that he was improvising too much, but it felt wholly original. And I think that was very influential for me. um, so yeah, I mean, as a child, like learning about, I was very curious. I used to ask, I think, my parents a lot of questions. I'm really grateful to them. We used to travel, every summer. My parents used to shut the clinic that they run for about 10-14 days, and we used to take the train and typically go up to the north. So Rajasthan, Manali, Uttarakhand, um, uh, all of these places. And we also traveled in the south quite a bit. My mom's South Indian, my dad's from Gujarat, but they both grew up in Bombay. But so yeah, these travels was something that I feel that I was always engaged in. uh, I don't think I was shut off to those experiences, and uh, I, it made me feel alive, like from a very early age. Like I felt something change. I felt something inside me change when the air around me changed. And I think that is I mean, I think of that as something formative in my childhood. So that's kind of what I was interested in. I was also interested in sport quite a bit. I used to play football for college. Um, and then I got obsessed with like the English Premier League growing up in the late 90s, early 2000s. Like that was a thing that a lot of boys of at least my, social class and my peer group were getting into, and I was no different. but then again, I got interested. Even there, I'd be interested in the name, in clubs from, say, Czechoslovakia, and like what's happening, say, like what's the Bulgarian Premier League like. And I used to go and look up this stuff on the internet, which also fed into my sort of interest in quizzing. And I used to quiz a lot in school, and then of course quizzed. The modes were different. Like school quizzing is quite different from, say, college quizzing and then open quizzing. Uh, but yeah, I think all of this kind of curiosity fed into, into the quizzing habit, which I've kind of left behind a little bit over the last year or so. But for a long time, it was a big part of my life, and it started with school. It started with quizzing in school. Um, and just to round this off, I mean, I feel like one thing I've often been asked is, how do you prepare for quizzes? And what do you read? And do you make notes? And when I thought about that question, and I've been asked that a few times, when that's when I realized that I didn't really make notes. So I didn't have like it came very naturally to me. So this thing of like learning about new things, like I used to obsessively read the newspaper since maybe I was about 11, 12 years old, and I used to start with the back pages, with the sports pages. And it never felt like I had to prepare for a quiz. And even when we went to sort of the Bonvita quiz contest when I was in school, or these other quizzes, and you did, like, your teachers wanted you to like look at, they used to publish these old books, no, with the Bonvita quiz contest question. So they wanted you to kind of go through it and spend time in the library, and I always found that a little absurd. I'm like, this is the whole point of quizzing is that you don't have to prepare for it. It's just uh, it just you do it because you're interested in several things in life more generally. So yeah, sorry if I rambled on, but these are some of the things that I think I remember from my childhood, and maybe hopefully should give you a sense of what I was like as a kid, at least some sense.
No, that's wonderful, Vikram. I think there are so many, tangents and interests, and you see that coming through in how you frame or talk about your career as well, right? You see your interest in, podcasting, whether it's your journalism, whether it's the fact that you were a practicing lawyer. I find that quite intriguing that someone's able to embed themselves in all these worlds, but not just embed themselves, but also practice it at a level where you are competent, right? And I feel like some seeds of that may have come back, come or go back to those roots in your childhood of being curious about all these disciplines. And, the fact that you mentioned your parents were doctors and you were interested in the social sciences, I found that intersection quite interesting, because I think we're almost the same age. And I feel like growing up in a particular class in India, the expectations at that time, at least of the late millennial bunch, was rather rigid and fixed. We had a certain expectation in terms of career outlines and what to pursue. You had the science, commerce, and arts, and those were sort of the big disciplines. But one thing I wanted to ask you about, Vikram, is your relationship with books. Were you an early reader? Did you have people around you reading a lot? And what were the first books that you really enjoyed reading, and where are you with that relationship today?
Mm, that's a big one. Um, because I think I've gone through sort of peaks and troughs in my reading journey. But it started with many peaks. I think I was always a very interested reader as a kid, as a child. I used to seek out books that were beyond sort of the curriculum, what was prescribed in school. And I mean, one of my early memories was these scholastic book fairs that used to happen in school. And I remember the excitement. It was always exciting to know that for the next, say, week or so, this book fair is going to be set up in the hall. And it was always a thrill to like go on that first day and look at what books are out there. I think for me it started one of the early kind of series that I was very interested in was these abridged classics versions, much smaller, this size, and I was I used to read a lot of those, but the one that kind of stands out for me the most is The Count of Monte Cristo. I think that's the book where I actually, for the first time, got a real sense of a narrative, right? That it was the first time that I thought about, like, okay, what is the writer, how has the writer done this? And I have like a vivid memory of this. Um, it's a revenge plot, right? It's about a guy who's imprisoned unfairly by his rivals, and then spends several years in prisons, escapes with the help of a mysterious priest who's based on a uh, real life person called Abe Faria, and there's a statue of Abe Faria in Panjim in Goa, and then he gets out and becomes this rich man, and changes his name, and then takes revenge on the people who wronged him. And the way this kind of the arc of this story, right, moving from point A to point B to point C, the way it moved me, it kind of stuck in my head for a long time. And even now, when I think about the book, I get very excited and very like hyped uh, by that arc. Not in the sense of, I think earlier when I was a kid, and when you're a kid, that's how you look at the world, right? There was a sense of, okay, I want to stick it to this guy who annoyed me on the playground. There's a heightened sense of injustice, and I think the book at that point fed into some of that. Like, a bit of, I'll show that. Um, but then as I grew older and kind of the dust settled on childhood, it was more of, it is like the characters in that book are so strong. The setting is so strong, right? Like, it's set in a particular period of France, and then there's a very vivid scene of him being taken in a boat to a place called Chateau d'If, which is off the coast of Marseille. And then when I went to Marseille, I was like, this is like kind of like a pilgrimage, and going and trying and seeing where Chateau d'If is, and um, so just all of that was, I think it was one, that feeling of being in a story and being like swept away by a story. I think Count of Monte Cristo uh, did that for me. And I used to read all sorts of things. I think when I was younger, Famous Five, the usual Enid Blyton stuff, and then I think this was just after my 10th grade, so I think it was 2007 when I read Midnight's Children by Salman Rushdie, and that blew my mind open in ways unimaginable at that point. And again, that feeling of, are you even allowed to write like this? Because Salman Rushdie has a very rich, immersive style. He uses a lot of these Indian words. There's a lot of detours, um, which stray from the plot, and then he kind of pulls you back. And it's a very loquacious, kind of vivid style. Of course, my own preferences have changed since then, since I was 16, 17. Uh, but at that point, it was like, it was beautiful, and there was something that he wrote in the introduction to the edition I'd read, which was an edition published 25 years after he won the Booker Prize for Midnight's Children in 1982. So 2007 was 25 years, and he writes the most beautiful introduction about the making of Midnight's Children. And he used to work in advertising at the point, in London, and he has this beautiful phrase about, he used to come back home and wash off the day. He used to get into the bath to wash off the day's advertising, and then sit and write, and then sit and work on his novel. So that kind of stuck with me, sort of as an early reference to this idea about separating, the creative work that you do uh, might be quite different from what you do for a living. So that sense, and of course this is something that I think about a lot now, and not out of choice also, because you have to think about this stuff, given sort of the career choices that I've made and my own journey. But I think that was an early indication of this idea of the economic kind of part of your life might be elsewhere and may not intersect with your creative life. Though, of course, for Salman, we know how that worked out. And again, in that same introduction, there's a beautiful uh, bit where his boss writes to him on the night that he wins the Booker, with saying that, well, one of us made it. His boss at the advertising agency. So then, of course, once Salman made it, I'm sure he's never had to go back to a day job again, uh, or doing stuff that he doesn't want to do for money, or he's made enough money from his novels. But yeah, so that was one inflection point. So maybe I'll speak to you. I'll answer this question in these inflection points in my reading life. Um, and then the other one was when I read this novel called Chinaman, which is by Sri Lankan writer called Shehan Karunatilaka, and he won the Booker recently for his second novel, I think a couple of years ago, uh, called The Seven Moons of Mali Almeida. But Chinaman was about this mysterious spinner from Sri Lanka who kind of drops off the map. And it's about an alcoholic journalist and his friend, sports journalist and his friend, who are trying to trace him down. And Chinaman was also the first book it was the first thing that I ever ordered online. So I'm just trying to locate it in kind of a period of time. And I think that's also how I think about life in so many ways. Uh, and this was 2011. The Cricket World Cup was going on. I remember the 2011 Cricket World Cup was going on. And again, that was just a moment when, uh, it touched on so many things that I'm particularly interested in, which is cricket, journalism, sports journalism, the idea of a lost hero, right? Like that's a trope that I'm personally like. I would watch and read anything that has this idea of a quest. I love a good quest story, or the story of like a forgotten genius, right? So that's a trope that I'm very interested in. And the way that book was written, it felt like it was written without any compromises to, how should I put it, like to the Western mode of writing, right? It was written by a first time South Asian novelist, uh, and it was uh, just so beautifully structured, and it was unapologetic about its obsessions and its characters' obsessions, and it explained things also in such a beautiful way. Like he has this way of breaking up chapters into little subsections, and little illustrations, hand-drawn illustrations that are done by his brother, of like a cricket pitch and a cricket ball, and those are meant to explain the game of cricket to people who aren't really interested in it. And I had so many people who aren't really interested in cricket come and tell me. So a lot of people in my life know how obsessed I am with the book, and they'll come and tell me, you know what, I'm not so interested in cricket, but I absolutely loved this book. It's also so accessible in that sense. But yeah, that was like a big influence. And then around the same time, I read a book by Rahul Bhattacharya, who's incidentally also a cricket journalist. So you're seeing a pattern here, called The Sly Company of People Who Care, which was a novel that is set in Guyana. And he went to Guyana in the Caribbean, uh, as well, actually in the South American continent, but culturally it's a Caribbean nation. He went to Guyana when he was as part of a cricket tour, and then came back and tried to write a non-fiction book about Guyana, which has this very complex history about of migration. Right? There's like slave labor from Africa that moved to Guyana, and the other big kind of ethnic group there is the indentured laborers who moved from India, who are known as the coolies. Uh, so it was about kind of the racial tensions between these two groups, and how that contributes to the making and unmaking of Guyana. But then, as he was writing the book, he realized that he was making stuff up, and then he felt that he might as well write a novel, and it is the most beautiful lyrical novel that I've read. Uh, the sentences over there just stuck with me in a way that few things have since. Uh, so that was another sort of big inflection point in my reading life. And in college, I used to read a lot, and both of these books I read while I was in college. And I think once I started working, I moved to London to work for a year and a half, and that opened a whole new world in terms of access, right? Some of the greatest bookstores in the world are in London. And just the kind of books that you can stumble across upon in a London bookstore. I once, not just the books, but I actually once bumped into Marlon James, who had won the Booker just a few days prior in a bookstore in London, and then he signed my copy um, of his book, and he was actually standing in front of a shelf that had a limited edition of Marcel Proust's In Search of Lost Time. And he was looking at it, and he kind of looked towards me, and then I mean I went up to him, and at some point in the conversation he looked at me and said, Do you think I should get it? And I said, Marlon, you won the Booker, you can do what you want. But yeah, sorry, slight detour there, but yeah, that's when I discovered a writer called Sam Selvin, who again from the Caribbean, from Trinidad, but wrote beautifully about London. So at that point of my reading life, I was also traveling a lot. Um, for I also moved to Japan for 6 months to work in the same firm, but in the office in Tokyo. But I was also traveling in Europe while I was living in London. And at that point, I was in the habit of reading about the places that I was going to. So that kind of marked that part of my reading life. I used to obsessively, like, even if I was going to a place for just a week or 5 days, I would track down, like, a novel that's set in the place, or a fantastic nonfiction book that's been set there, a travelogue. So that was then. But because of work, I think I fell out of the reading habit a little bit because the job was intense. I was working at a corporate law firm. Uh, and then when I moved back to India, and I joined journalism in Delhi, that's when I started sort of picked up again. I picked up the reading habit again. Uh, so yeah, since then it's been a bit of peaks and troughs. Like, I think over the last couple of years, I haven't read as much as I wanted to, and that is a function of just this whole scrolling era, right? Like, we're just used to scrolling and short form content. I watch a lot of stuff on YouTube. I think my primary sort of mode of media consumption is YouTube. And it's just so much, like, I find it so much easier to watch a video than engage with the written word, which is happening to so many of us, which is not a good thing for someone who wants to work with words, right? And does work with words on a day-to-day basis. But yeah, I've fallen out of the habit, like so many of us over the last couple of years. Yeah, always keep promising myself that I will fix it next month. So maybe this is the month that I start fixing it again.
Yeah, and because I think the way you talk about books, Vikram, there's so much love, but there's also so much curiosity in terms of, because all the books you recommended, I haven't read. I've read Pandits from Pakistan by Rahul Bhattacharya. I've read a couple of other books by Salman Rushdie, and I was super curious about Chinaman because of the characters in it. And as a cricket fan myself, I thought that would be just the perfect intersection between literature and sports that you could dive into. And um, but yeah, I there were so many things that your because it's also about the lives and minds of a reader, right? I find that really interesting because you were able to talk about it over a period of time. It's almost like you have a relationship with each author that isn't um, that isn't really physical, but it's more intellectual. And there's no other activity that we do as humans where you get this um, voyeuristic sort of experience of looking at people live their lives. And I've been reflecting on like the purpose of art. There's no other species that actually does that consistently. Look at other species of their kind and watch them do things and discuss why they do those things. So um, like your time at university, Vikram, just going off on a little bit of a tangent, I'm thinking about what you said about Salman Rushdie and balancing that. And I found that quite intriguing how that can inform your thinking about where you want to go personally. You'd often assume it would be your parents or closest friends that would make that decision for you. But I think readers have access to more information. And then, because I think we also grew up in an era where media sort of blew up, I think if you are someone that grew up in the 90s and early 2000s, I think we were the first generation that sort of experimented with new media, and sort of because I think if you've used, platforms like Orkut or MSN Messenger, I think you sort of know what a world of old media was like and what a world of new media was like. I, I'd want to know about your experience at university, and not from the perspective of only the subjects you've studied, but, what was it like being a law student? Why were you curious about that world? Um, what did you not like about that world? So maybe a bit about your life as a law student and lawyer, and some things you still hold on to from that experience.
Yeah, university again was a place that kind of blew my mind open in ways that, I mean, I see the sort of fallout of that even now. Um, and I think it's similar to something that, in your conversation with Rohan Banerjee, who you've spoken to before, wonderful writer on Substack. Uh, it's similar. I did a similar 5-year course in Bangalore at the National Law School in Bangalore, and at that point I feel like my life was quite circumscribed in the even physically, right? Because I'd grown up in Mumbai and gone to a school which was 10 minutes from my home. I'd gone to a junior college, like 11th and 12th standard was in a college again which was 10 minutes from my home, and that was my world. And then you go to the kind of college that I went to, where there were people from all over the country. I think this idea for me, what was defining about the college experience was this sense of how vast and wonderful our country is. I think that is the first time that uh, you know, I, I felt it, and I also was we were learning about these things and the first couple of years, I think, as Rohan also pointed out in the podcast, was you do a lot of social science subjects. So the hardcore kind of legal subjects start from like late second year onwards, and that also reflects my levels of interest in the classroom in law school. For the first couple of years, I was extremely engaged with what was happening. I do all the readings. This is history, political science, sociology, um, and it was, and one thing leads to another. In even like a prescribed reading would lead you to something else, and then to something else, and through that I discovered a lot of interesting ideas, and a lot of it about India, which then went on and helped my own work in journalism and continues to. So I think for me, that experience of living, I also lived, it was a residential sort of setup. So I lived in a hostel with people from all over the country, uh, what they ate, how they grew up, what they thought about, their dreams, their hopes, their aspirations, so much of it. And it kind of made me, I mean, pardon the cliche, but like to fall in love with the country, what's and all, right? Uh, and of course, I have, it's a love hate relationship with your own nation, and there are days and phases where you feel like nothing's, there are a lot of things that are wrong and need to be fixed, and nothing's happening. But I think most days you wonder how this disparate this collection of so many different communities and languages and ways of life and ways of thought have held together in one sort of what we call the Democratic Republic, right? And that is a project that that interests me no end, right? Like this whole idea about and so college for me, a lot of college for me was that. I know this doesn't maybe directly answer your question about the like about the law. I feel like I was not so curious about law as a subject, but I think it opened doors for me, right? Like sitting in those classrooms, like constitutional law, for instance, opened the door for me. There was this The constitution was put together by this massive sort of collective called the Constituent Assembly, right, with 500 plus people, and these people kind of sat together and gave us what we now know as a constitution, which has been amended multiple times, 100 plus times, but more or less has stayed intact, which is not something you can say about several countries in the neighborhood, especially. So that project, and there are volumes of the Constituent Assembly debates, and we read some of that as part of our coursework, and then beyond, and just the ideas, the kind of things that they were discussing about what the new nation should look like, what the republic should look like. I feel like that was formative for me, in many senses. So yeah, that was one thing about college, just the diversity uh, of experience, of not just inside the classroom. Like you were, of course, you were the range of reading inside the classroom was was of a kind that I hadn't experienced before, and also this kind of Socratic method of learning, where some of the, especially the social sciences classes, right, with the law classes, it was still a little more like the lecturing, like, but with some of the social science classes, there was still this Socratic mode of learning, where an idea is thrown at you, and then you discuss it in class, and you find different ways of coming at it. uh, and that kind of, just, I was already interested in the social sciences, but that kind of deepened my interest in it. And I think there was a kind of insecurity for some time, because as you know, my parents are doctors, and like you touched upon this a little earlier. There's this culture of like science learning, and how science learning is the thing to do and the way to go, and how you one should think about their lives, and especially if you're like you know an Indian man growing up in a certain kind of milieu, that is the path that you're expected to be on. um, but what happened in these social science classes in college, in law school, was it just reinforced and deepened uh, my sort of conviction that this is what I'm temperamentally more suited to. And there is no shame in that. And there is no, like, there's this wealth of knowledge and understanding available, in these areas of learning. Um, and that is what I want to double down on. And and these are areas and things that I think that I want to spend the rest of my life learning about, whether not whether it makes me money or doesn't make me money, whatever it is. There was a brief period when I was contemplating, like, academia, and whether I should, build a career in social science academia. But even beyond that, these are ideas. It seemed to me an inexhaustible field of knowledge and learning, and I knew that I'm not going to be bored with it at any point. There is so much to read and learn. So for me, that was also that was, I think, the defining part of my law school sort of academic experience.
And like you mentioned something about, you know, it just got me thinking about the Indian identity, that you got to sort of expose yourself to, or put yourself in, and I've been thinking about this at a personal level, right? Because we grew up in a city like Mumbai, but our parents may be from other places, and it's so complex, because what does it mean to be Indian as well, right? You can speak the language, and most of us speak like two or three languages. We speak English, we speak Hindi, and maybe there's another state language depending on where
Mhm.
you're from, right? And I think for you it's interesting because you have this influence of parents from two different states, and I feel like that can also. And then I'm assuming that you communicate and think in English, but again, that's a language that is not spoken by a majority of the country, and you write in English. Um, like the question I wanted to ask you, Vikram, is how has your thinking about your identity as an Indian changed over time? And maybe you can answer this question by talking about your linguistic roots, from in terms of where you've come from, but also in terms of what you've observed in the cities you've stayed in over time, because you've spent time in cities like Mumbai, Delhi, Bengaluru, which are these large metros, but you also have experience living in cities like London and Tokyo, which are the hubs of multiculturalism in those places. So, something about the idea of identity and how you think about it, and how you've thought about it over time.
Mm. This is it's a fraught question, Abhishek. I mean, this is something that I think about a lot. And just going back to that point that you make about thinking in English, writing in English in a country that that has all of these languages, and so that tension is something that exists all the time. And of course, a lot of Indian novelists who write in English have spoken about this, have written about this. Uh, and even in kind of the Indian literary tradition, right, there is this distinction between IWE, which is Indian writing in English, and the Bhasha, what's now sometimes pejoratively called the Bhasha stuff, the vernacular, the writing in the vernacular languages. So it's something that I grapple with quite a bit. I feel like uh, you you do feel disconnected from from large parts of the country, and you know that there are ways of life and ways of thinking that are not going to be that are not available to you. You're not going to be able to access them unless you achieve a certain level of linguistic and cultural proficiency, right? And one of the things that I don't feel very nice about is that I'm not linguistically proficient in any sort of Indian language in the way that I would like to be. I mean, I speak Hindi, and again, my Hindi was I had grown up speaking Bombaya Hindi in Mumbai, and then I went to college, and I had roommates from the north, and then that's a slightly different mode of speaking Hindi. Uh, that's something that I picked up a little bit while I was in college, and then I lived in Delhi. So my Hindi is, I think, I mean, my North Indian friends would disagree, but my Hindi is okay. But I don't speak in Kutchi, which is my father's, you know, mother tongue. And my mother is Tamilian, and my Tamil is not good at all. Like, I understand like 70% of the language, but I still find it hard to hold entire conversations in Tamil. And it's the same with Kutchi. I understand it pretty well, but it's hard for me to communicate. So that's something that uh, I wish that I had thought about more seriously. But of course, my parents didn't speak either of their mother tongues at home, right? Like they spoke to each other in Hindi or English or Hinglish, right? Uh, so it's not something that I grew up hearing either of their languages that on a daily basis at home. But I wish that I had, you know, I wish that I'd taken more interest in it. So that's something that speaking about identity, that's something that I feel bad about. But I feel bad about it mostly on the linguistic element of it. Uh, Honestly, Abhishek, I don't crave a sense of community in that sense. Like I wouldn't, I don't sense a crave of like, I don't crave a sense of the community that comes from being part of a group that is, from, like, I don't feel rooted in that sense to either of, you could call, my home states, right, which is Gujarat and Tamil Nadu. Though my mother's father grew up in Kerala, in Palakkad. Uh, but so I don't feel rooted. I consider myself as like completely a creature of like a cosmopolitan city, and I have kind of no qualms about that. There's no sense of embarrassment or anything about that. And I think that itself, there is an Indian way to be, right? Even as a denizen of a city. So I've loved my time in all the three Indian cities that I've spent like a substantial period of time in, which is uh, Bangalore, which is Mumbai, Bangalore, and Delhi. And I love all of them for different reasons, and I'm exasperated by all of them for different reasons. But it is my natural kind of habitat, uh, and yeah, and I derive my sense of identity from from being part of like a certain kind of Indian city life. So there is, so to sum it up, I think there is a sense of uh, slight embarrassment. Also, you could say there is a sense of tension about not gaining about not speaking Indian languages proficiently, because that would give me access, and the embarrassment comes from it giving me access to ways of thinking and say a literary tradition, for instance, right? Say if I read in Kannada, I spent 5 years in Bangalore, and if I'd taken learning Kannada seriously, maybe I could have read, say, a book that I really love called Gachar Gochar, which is in English, written by Vivek Shanbag, translated beautifully in English by Srinath Perur, but would have loved to read something like that in Kannada. That's, I think, my kind of embarrassment comes more from, because I'm curious about this country and I want to learn more about its ways of thinking and being, almost from the outside, so that I can understand it, then maybe make sense of it in my work, or you know in the way I think about the place. That's where it comes from, but not in terms of uh, kind of the roots slash DNA kind of way. Not so much. I'm very happy to, I think, be part of like the larger universe of the sprawling and exasperating Indian city.
Love that, yeah. And because there are so many ways to be Indian, right? And there's not a particular sort of ideal version of doing
Yeah,
it,
yeah,
right? And I think it also goes back to our historical roots of what the country was before it became India, right? I mean, we had like a South Asian identity that combined so many other sort of ways of being too, right? So, um, Vikram, because I am like an educator myself, one thing I'm always curious about when people tell me about their profession is how did they acquire the skills they needed to do those things? Did they take up a course? Did they, work with someone that was a practitioner of that? For instance, I see the connection with law, right? You studied law for 5 years, but with your career in journalism and writing fiction, I mean, you've got a story published in a publication like Mint, which is like a leading national daily, and you've been uh, associated with a lot of magazines like 52, Mint Lounge. You continue to write on other platforms too. How did you, I mean, this may sound a little silly, but how did you develop the courage to decide that you would transition into a career like journalism or even writing fiction? Because I know you take both of these things very seriously as a writer, and like especially when you had so much at stake as a lawyer working in an international law firm in some of the biggest cities in the world. So I'm just curious about your psychology, and was that like a sudden shift, or was that something brewing within you for a long time that you have been preparing to transition into at a personal and professional level? So yeah, I don't know if that question makes sense, but I hope you get the direction where I'm going.
yeah, completely. It makes complete sense, and um, I think it was always brewing, Abhishek. I feel like there was always a sense of I want to work with words. I think I want to be around words in a way that not in a special occasion kind of way. I want to integrate it as part of my life. I mean, I think from an early age I had a sense of like reading for leisure, and like doing like working with words for leisure and then doing it for a living. Um, and I never put myself in the category that reads to chill out. You know, I never saw myself as someone who reads and writes to relax. It's a hobby. Like this word hobby is something that like I didn't want to associate it with how I feel about reading and writing. So I think that is the feeling where it came from, and I think that had already formed. By the way, by the time by the time I was in college, I used to write for a website called Sportskida. I think they were the people who paid me first for a piece of writing, and at that point, I was amazed that okay, someone you sit in a room in front of your laptop and staring at a wall, and you write something on a blank Word document where there was nothing, and it was entirely an creature of your imagination, and then you get someone gives you money for it, and more than that, like there are strangers sharing it online and writing to you, uh, and saying that, you know what, I like this line or this resonated with me, and thank you so much for writing it. And that never gets old, Abhishek. Like even now, the fact that you reached out and about some of my work and you said you read it, and like there's nothing that comes close to that feeling. uh so that has stayed. So I think that's kind of what gave me a sense that okay, maybe you need to design your life in a way that you're able to do this on a daily basis. uh though the big shift that had happened was this idea was a little more naive when it started, right? And it's not been too long actually. It's only the last 2 3 years that I've been able to more properly de-link uh, the economic part of my life from the creative part. So the creative part doesn't really, as we know, make money. A lot of things have to fall into place for the creative bits to for you to make a living, lock, stock, barrel out of the creative bits. You have to be extremely good, extremely talented, extremely disciplined, extremely lucky, be in the right place. So a lot of things have to come together. And it's also hits business in a way, right? Like if one thing blows up, then you get a bunch of opportunities after that, and it is a precarious kind of existence. Uh, but I still had this thing that no, I'm going to make a living out of like creative work, out of like work that I really want to do. But that I've been able to make that distinction, especially since I went freelance a couple of years ago. That the stuff that pays your bills and makes your money need not be imaginative, and that has really helped me sort of settle some of my inner conflicts over that I've had for a long time. I still work with words in my day jobs. So it was that. It was like, okay, what can I still do that is broadly around like writing, editing words, sentences that kind of pays my bills. Uh, and then just separating and delinking this creative part, the stuff that I do on Substack, the fiction that I want to write, etc. So that is how it's evolved.
Yeah, because I think the word you use is design your life, right? I feel like that's a word I find quite interesting, because it's unimaginable what the media landscape that evolved over the past 20 years did for people growing up in that age in terms of the possibilities of careers you could imagine. For instance, back in the day, someone writing online, I mean, these big news media houses were limited to a very, very few people that wrote from, particular centers of the country, right? But then I think power got distributed when media opened up, and it wasn't any more the big media houses. It was also individual players in local contexts, and not just in local contexts, but in very specialized media outlets like media for sports, media for travel, So I I think and I see that coming through, especially in the generation that grew up immersed in these media forms, right? They're not afraid to define their lives um, And I think at certain points you have to do that, right? Like, what do you get paid by, right? Because professions are often defined in terms of larger brackets, like law, engineering. And I think, especially the late millennials, we grew up in an age where it was expected to have a base degree, right? And then you jump off that base degree to figure out what you want to do beyond that, But I see a lot of younger people moving away from that path, exploring base degrees in fields that can lead to careers. And because I was able to relate to a lot of the things you were saying in terms of, you know, pursuing that, dividing that economic and creative sort of part, because I feel like I am of that world sort of view. But I know friends who say that, why is that distinction there? So much more unhinged in terms of, I'm going to go all in without being worried about that. I think that comes with a certain degree of privilege too, right? In terms of the economic liberties and space you have,
Exactly.
But I wanted to double down on, the craft piece a little bit, Vikram. I loved, Substack was where I first found out about your work. There are so many pieces I wanted to talk to you about. Whether it was the piece about Hrithik Roshan and his dance performance. Your piece about Virat Kohli, and it was sort of a tribute to his retirement recently. But that piece seemed like it was sort of brimming for over 10 or 15 years, because you, in the piece, as I was reading it, you know and I spoke to Sarthak about this as well, because he had written something similar. But I love how that piece was not just something that could come out as an assignment, and I don't know how many media houses would have the space to accommodate something like that, because you were looking at your love for the game sort of evolved with Virat Kohli's rise, and you were capturing this sort of tension that emerged in Indian cricket, where we were looking at the old guard of, like the Dravid Lakshman era, and a particular brand of cricket being played there. Like in your piece, I sort of got this, it's hard to articulate, but this shift of guard, but also you're communicating it from the perspective where this shift of guard is going to another direction now, right? So I found it fascinating how you were able to capture a person's career, but also communicate these slight tensions that came through in your piece. And, also talking about the peaks and troughs of an athlete's life. For instance, like with Virat Kohli, 2018 was that big year where he got those three big centuries, in the Sena countries that we consider like a big deal, right? But then you see this drop over the last 5 years. The question, I think, what I wanted to ask you is if you could help me maybe understand one of your fictional pieces and one of your non-fiction pieces. Like I read Kukri, which am I saying it right, Vikram? Is that how
Yeah,
you?
yeah, yeah. But a Nepali friend of mine said it's Kukri.
Kukri, okay,
Yeah, Kukri. But we can say
interesting.
Kukri. Yeah.
So yeah, you can go in any direction, but if you could tell me about the Kohli piece and your piece Kukri, and just tell me how you ideated and brought it to life, and this I'm also thinking about from, because I wanted to capture a bit of your thinking right now, Vikram. If there's a young reader reading this, reading that piece, thinking about how they can go about writing their work, if this could be like some sort of guidance for that reader, but also for you to maybe look back on as an archive of how you thought about this piece, maybe challenging future versions of yourself that write the same thing, right? So maybe a little bit about the Kohli piece and Kukri and how that both of these things came about.
Thank you so much for engaging, first of all, with these so deeply. Like I said, there is no greater honor and no greater pleasure for anyone who writes. At least, I mean, maybe not anyone. I know some people write for themselves, but I've always written with the idea of being read. I've always wanted to be read and for people to engage with what's out there. So thank you so much. Like that really means a lot. And honestly, on the bad days, like this is the kind of stuff that keeps one going. Like just the memory of this kind of stuff, for knowing, someone sent a message, you get a DM from a stranger saying that, I read this and just really enjoyed it. So yeah, thanks for that. Maybe I'll start with the Kohli piece. And I know that you played age group level cricket, and you did mention how you toured the UK as a schoolboy. Um, yeah, so you're right. Like I always look at things through. There's a slight personal lens I feel in the way that I approach things, and a lot of this stuff is there is no place for it in the mainstream media, and that place for it in the mainstream media has shrunk even further. In 2019, I remember there was a personal essay that I'd written about Cricket World Cups, which I just wrote it for. There was a Cricket World Cup special issue, and one of the people at Mint said, "Do you want to write something?" And I wrote it and said, "You know what? We'll run it as a cover story." So it wasn't meant to be like a big two-pager. But I don't think uh, if that kind of thing can happen now, right? Like that's how much like the media ecosystem also has changed over the last few years. Things are really squeezed. Um, yeah, I mean the way I imagined it was uh, this arc, no, what you mentioned, like you were probably thinking about it for 10-15. I think the arc is a subconscious uh, background score in my head all the time. And like I'm a pretty vivid thinker in terms of that whole thing that where were you when the towers fell, right, in the 9/11, like uh, I remember things like that. So it's like I remember where I'd be, say, watching a game, especially if something momentous or historic happens in that game, uh, and that kind of helps this kind of personal essay mode of writing, where you have these two in parallel tracks, and what helps you, uh, what gives it that the narrative quality is the intersection of the parallel tracks, right? The points where tracks that are ordinarily parallel intersect. And I feel like I do have, sometimes I write it down, sometimes I mean, make a note of it somewhere. Uh, and sometimes it just sticks in the subconscious. And then when I want to write a piece like Kohli, I may have, like, I'll probably tap into an older archive where I've made some notes about, and these are not diary entries. These are not like journal entries where I'm writing in full sentences or anything. These could literally be bullet points or just a string of words. And often I go back and I actually don't have a memory of what I scribbled up. Like, what does this mean? I have like something vague, but the whole picture doesn't come to me sometimes. Uh, and then I kind of just cobble all this stuff together with like with a narrative spine. So, for instance, with the Kohli piece, the moment that he announced the retirement, the moment that the news broke on Twitter, which is where I first saw it, I knew that this is something that I want to write about. And then it took me a week. It took me for 2-3 days. Then I was just collecting, like going back into my email archive also, and seeing where I was kind of at that point in my life, because of these, like trying to find these points of like my parallel arc, then the point of intersection. So some of that can be useful. A lot of this exercise of trawling the email archives and trawling the Google Photos archive and trawling the Google Drive, it like maybe 20-25% of uh, it actually makes it to the piece in terms of like actual images, actual events, and but this exercise was also more for the feel of it, like just the memory of who I was, as a person at that point of time, uh, and what were the things that I was thinking about, and what was the general mahal, right, as they say in the Hindi Urdu word mahal. Well, the mahal kya tha tab in your life at that point of life, and that's what helps me, I think, construct something like the Kohli piece. And then there's the more technical aspects of it, right? Which is like constructing his track, which is going and looking at, say, ball by ball, of innings, of certain innings that he's played, right? Like the one at Centurion in 2018 in South Africa, for instance, where he got the one, he played that knock, and then Perth, and then you go to Edgbaston, and also see what how writers had reported, how sports journalists had reported that the day's plays on that day. So going into Cricinfo, going into that archive, seeing what was said there. Um, so for the first 2, 3, 4 days, just collecting this material. And my problem actually, Abhishek, is I don't know if we'll discuss it in a different question, like more about uh, the mode, right? Like more generally, uh, is when I'm working on something like this, it just kind of takes over my life. And especially when it's something like time bound, right? Like I wanted to get the Kohli piece out within a week of his retirement because that's when everyone's talking about it. It's fresh in people's minds. So I wanted to get, so I have that journalistic sense is still there, Miki. Story bahar aana chahiye, jaldi, you know. The moment should not pass. But it just kind of takes over my life in so many ways. But then now you have all these commitments where uh, there's the paid work that you have to do and you have to show up and there are deadlines, uh, and so one thing that I haven't, just to go back to a previous theme that we were discussing, one thing that I haven't cracked and I'm getting a little like worked up about it and anxious about it is just separating these two uh, aspects of my life in like cleaner ways, like just the boundary drawing, and imposing a sense of discipline. That's not happened, and I just thought I should like mention this to maybe to you and your listeners, some of whom who may be, you know who may have solutions for this, and who also may be struggling with the same thing. Anyway, to come back to the Kohli piece, so that's what the first 2, 3 days were about. And then while I am sitting down, I used to go jog on the beach or walk on the beach. At that point, I used to live close by, just moved recently. So I would, after my jog, I'd just kind of sit down and on the sand and try and create a narrative spine for the story. This almost the section breaks as such. So that's the other thing the journalism has given me, and especially working for a magazine like 52, where I worked on a lot of long form journalism. It's like thinking of it in terms of sections. Uh, just uh, piecing up a longer kind of story into manageable narrative chunks. Uh, that's what I did. And then the 2, 3 days after that, uh, it's about like writing it out, uh, and like kind of just putting it down. And then so there's a first draft that's put together maybe by the end of, like, you work on it for a couple of days, but then the next couple of days, say the Friday, I think I put it out on Saturday evening. So the Friday and Saturday was about just chipping away at everything that's not the piece. So you have like a sprawling draft, or you have like there's all these things that you're saying. And especially in the personal mode, you can be a little more indulgent, right? Like you go down things that you go down paths about your own life that you remember vividly, and you write about it. So I think those 2 days, Friday and Saturday, were about kind of whittling down the piece into the form that finally goes there. And I think it ended up being a 2,700 word uh, pub story, but it was a lot longer and a lot messier, and uh, maybe a little more vulnerable. There was some stuff that I've then maybe felt, okay, this is a little too personal for me to put out, and then I kept a little bit of that out. Uh, yeah, yeah, and it was also then going back and fact checking a few things, because there were a bunch of like numbers and there were some facts there. And again, this is a habit from that I picked up from journalism.
Hmm.
Just going and looking at it. So that was Kohli.
Yeah, like, before we go into the other piece, Vikram, this is just a very raw perspective as a reader as well, right? Because during that period, I remember reading a lot of pieces about Kohli, right? And as a reader, what stays with me, right? And I wasn't just a reader, I'm a huge cricket fan, right? So much so that I've I saw the Cricket World Cup in 2011 at Wankhede, somehow managed to, fight for those tickets. And then I remember Kohli playing then. I remember Kohli playing at the Wankhede because I'm like a Bombay resident, all my memories of Kohli are. So I saw him play in the 2016 semi-finals with West Indies in the T20 World Cup. And, most of my 20s were memories of Kohli's careers and his ups and downs, right? I don't know if it's a particularly Indian thing to associate our life with, with the Bollywood stars or these cricket stars, because these are like the two big sort of spaces that everyone's sort of attention goes down to. And I don't know where that's come from subconsciously too, right? And um, I don't know, like what stayed with me, like with Sarthak's piece, I think it was the intensity of Kohli. I feel like in the Natya Shastra, they call it the Ras theory, right? So I think nonfiction pieces also have this sense of flavor, the sense of texture, right? In your piece, I think what stayed with me was the personal connections brought out the sort of ups and downs of a career's an athlete's career, right? And I think the way your piece was structured was also to show you how an athlete is also a human being, right? You started off with Kohli talking about, his early 2000, I think 12 or 14 tours to Australia and that 100, and then you linked that video. I was actually following your links and seeing, and then it was interesting to see Kohli physically change, right? And then, you know, peaking in that 2018 period with those centuries, but then you also feel this sadness, because you can associate with this human being that's completely given their life to a sport, and not just in a very, you can see that this person's actually committed to this, in a very world domination weird sort of, I want to do everything possible to do this well, right? And I think you also beautifully captured the loss of that spark, towards the end, that there are some things you can't control in an athlete's life, that even though you want to give that. So I feel like that was the texture that I got off your piece, is that athletes have this trope, but you don't remember them just for the hopeful start or the messy end. You remember them for one shot or that particular year where something magical happened. And I feel like that, as a reader, I think I was able to capture that texture in the Kohli piece that I read, that you wrote, and I just wanted to share that with you as well. But like, I just want to respect time as well, Vikram. Like, this would just be the last one or two questions, because we said we'd end at 3. Can we go about 5 to 10 minutes over, if that's okay?
We can go till 4.
Okay,
So that's
so
not a problem at all. We can go up till 4 if you like.
perfect.
So,
Yeah, I just
yeah.
wanted to check in about that. But yeah, I'm curious about, again, like, to quickly, I loved the story. I loved the mystery element of it. I loved how immersive that world was. And I think I sent you an email asking you if you were like, you had a career as a spy back
Yeah.
in the day, because it seemed like you knew the nitty-gritties of this world, but you also seem to know a little bit about, this Indian High Commission life. And, both the careers had different NRI identities, being which I picked up. I don't know if you were thinking about that as a writer as well. So yeah, about Kukri and like how that came about.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Abhishek. Kukri was so I've wanted to do something in the spy space for some time. Actually, co-written a movie concept with my dear friend Shankadip Gupta, who is also the co-writer and researcher on Barefoot Boys, the podcast that we co-wrote and co-researched. So that's how I met Shankadip, and we had co-written a concept. We hadn't gotten through the script, but you write something called like a synopsis, which you then register with the Screenwriters Association, and that has, treatment note and things like that. So I'd done a fair amount of thinking around, like, I do think about spy stories a lot. um I love like the kind of the noir feel of them. I like this simmering undercurrent of, what's going to happen, and the personal stories, right? I really enjoy, like, spies are, it's the human interest element of it. They're people, like anyone else at the end of the day, but they are a little like they get into this business because there's something a little off about them. There's something slightly like off center about them, and those are people that I find interesting generally. And So yeah, and as you can probably tell, like one of the themes of my work is like a lot of my work is driven by the inner life. So of course, like the spy story is a good device to mix up like the inner life and the outer world. And so that's kind of where the idea of doing a spy story came from. And this Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy was, an inspiration. Even when we were writing the movie synopsis, that was an inspiration. Um, so yeah, mood and treatment is something I also think. I think a little visually. Like scenes come to my head, single scenes, and then I try and string it together into a narrative. So that's exactly what happened with Kukri. So for it's either tropes or it's scenes. So the trope is something I mentioned earlier to you was this trope of the forgotten genius, right? Or the old dog that still has a few tricks, right? These are tropes, and there are countless movies and countless books and creative work that has this as its starting point. Uh, so I take this as a starting point and then see what I can do with it in a way that's what I consider to be original. So Kukri kind of started like that. It's informed by they say write what you know, and I'm glad that you actually I know half you in jest mainly actually that you asked did you work as a spy while you were abroad, but a couple of people asked me that like seriously. And at least one person I know asked me that seriously, and that was to me like that actually felt really good, that the story made them kind of feel that. But it's also a combination. So Kukri also comes from research of like go and look at what's spy memoirs. Of course you're inspired a lot again like by the movies, by the books. um, so yeah, it's like a mix of all of these influences, and you can kind of construct a rough idea of what a spy's life maybe could look like. Somebody who's probably worked for Raw and reads it goes like, oh, it's nothing like this, um, and which is fine. And for instance, Melville, right? There's a character called Melville who's a
Mm.
professor, an American professor who comes and teaches at at a law school in Bangalore. No resemblance to real events, but Melville is actually based on someone called Granville Austin, who's an Indian, who's a scholar of Indian constitutional law. He was an American scholar of Indian constitutional law, and someone who I spoke to who knows his work well and knows his family, because I think he's written a bunch of things on Austin and had access to his papers and things like that. One suggested to me that Austin may have been on CIA payroll, right? Like, and there is a tradition. And then when you look back, say there was a magazine called Quest, and my own, my ex boss was the editor of 52 Supriya while she was at Mint, wrote this story about a magazine called Quest, which was kind of rumored to be CIA funded and things like that. So there are all these connections, and then you kind of join the dots. It's you take these real life inspirations and then like churn maybe a story out of it in a way that sounds convincing. So I think that is where Kukri came from. And it also came from the fact that um, I wanted it to be like, I wanted to tell the story about someone who chooses to live by themselves, who chooses like a solitary life. And I think especially in India, it's very, there is a community mode of living, right? Like the individualism is like stamped out of us, and it's like, you know, it's looked down upon in so many ways, and it's seen as like a kind of a loser thing to do to uh, to have this, like, to be by yourself, like romantically, or to, you know have this, build a life, but not for somebody. you know there's this, we valorize the whole, "Oh, I'm doing this for my family," and that's great, right? Like, it's it's what our whole society is based on. And but in valorizing that, I think we also look down on other modes of
Yeah.
life.
Yeah.
And I think some part of me, through a protagonist, through a character, wanted to capture the sort of the particular joys and the particular griefs of, like, choosing to be an individual, like in stretching the individualism, right? In the sense of, like, stretching the individualism. I know we say no man is an island, and no man is an island, but here there was a sense of, what if a man has, wants to be an island in some aspects of his life? Or what if a man is exploring the idea of being an island? Uh, that is something that I tried to capture with Watts and all. I didn't want to. It isn't meant to be a hagiography, as you can see through the story. Like, it's not all fun and games. It's not. It's a heavy story, right? In a way. So, but I wanted to give the character that agency, that these are choices that I'm making. Of course, there are certain circumstances that have pushed me into a corner, but you cannot beat down my mind. You cannot imprison my mind. And I think so. This is an idea that I want to explore somehow in fiction. And I thought the spy story was like the character of a spy, or the protagonist as a spy, was a good way to explore some of these themes that I was thinking about more generally.
Yeah, because it's hard to it's so much fun to discuss a story you've read with someone that's written it, Vikram. I don't think we get the opportunity to do that as much, right? Because I think readers do this subconsciously, how much of it is inspired, which I think is a question that can frustrate writers as well sometimes, right? Because they're creating fictional worlds, and I think there's always a seed that may be inspired, but it obviously can't always be influenced by the person's life, right? But then also because as a student of literature, I personally find it challenging to wear different hats, like when I studied literature at university, my hat was primarily the hat of a critic, right? I would read it formally. I would read it, using all these lenses, whether it's the psychoanalytic lens, the formalist lens, the realistic lens. And then once I get into the postmodernist lens, I'm not even looking for story and plot, right? I'm trying to discern meaning, but then I try putting on another hat of just this emotional reader, like what is the emotional core of this character, right? And I find it very interesting how authors are able to bring out intersectional identities of the character, like, and how you may be at a position of privilege in one identity, but then be in a marginalized position in another. And I saw some of that coming through in this story too, right? With the sexuality of the characters, being talked about. Again, I don't want to reveal anything about the plot, but you know, but then their professional identity working in a particular section of society also coming through. And then you also notice the economic privilege of working in a particular country, in a particular position. But then also the national marginalization of, being uprooted from your root culture. And I maybe wasn't able to pick up if they were immigrants or first generation immigrants. And so all of these, sort of influence my perspective. But then I was sort of also thinking about the time period, which I don't think you gave very distinct clues about. And I don't know if that was intentional too, because I was trying to capture, was there a physical moment or a time that sort of came through? So a lot of little pieces and bits stayed out for me. And I do hope, I'm excited to read the other short story you put out on Substack, Dalliance, right? Is that
Yes,
how you
yes.
say it? So I will, review, like read that and like definitely share some thoughts, Vikram. So for the last question, Vikram, I have so much more to ask you, but what I will do is this is just a small 1 hour conversation. I think the best way to engage with Vikram's work is to follow the show notes. I will be linking Vikram's writing, samples of the same, the pieces we've discussed, but also links to other work. For instance, Barefoot Boys is a podcast that Vikram co wrote and co researched. And it's a beautiful podcast about Mohun Bagan, a team that should be a national pride in a lot of ways, but they have this forgotten legacy. And it's also about sports, but also about culture. It's a beautiful podcast that I have loved as a podcast, like sort of listener. And also a lot of Vikram's travel pieces, his writing on Substack, which you can access for free. Um, but Vikram, for the last question, this goes back to my love for podcasts in general. I listen to this podcast called Desert Island Discs, where they throw a person on an island and ask them if they can take like 7 pieces of music with them. But this is sort of a modification on that because you've spent some time telling me about the books that influenced you. As a media consumer, this question is more if you were put on a desert island and you had to take one piece of film, a TV show, and maybe, I don't know, a song or an album that you could take with you. So this is sort of a media sort of discussion about the media you've loved and consumed. So any recommendations and maybe a few lines about what stayed with you about that show in similar vein to the way you were talking about the books, so a media, uh, a film, a TV show, and a song, and maybe you can add another recommendation that you will take with you to this desert island and you will have to keep watching and maybe get something new from every time you see it. So yeah.
Wow. There's actually lots to choose from. I think it's a little difficult to whittle it down to one. But um, if I had to take a film, it would be Ocean's 12. I I mean, might sound like a slightly lowbrow choice, um, but I find it so the way the movie is put together is something that I find so interesting. Like I always like Steven Soderbergh, who's the director, his work. But as a heist film, I feel like it is such an entertaining film, while also it it, it really touches some deep emotions, but not in a kind of a ponderous, arty kind of way. There's a place for that, of course, and there's lots of media and lots of films that I love that do that in this kind of artistic, ponderous way. But the thing I love about Ocean's, and it's one of those movies that I can watch at any point from any place, and I always end up like coming out of it in a much better mood and better frame of mind, and wanting to sort of swallow life whole. Yeah. So I think it would be Ocean's 12 as the movie. I mean, if I can add one more movie, it would be Lutera, which is in terms of pace, which this is Vikramaditya's Motwani's film Lutera. In terms of pace, it's quite different to Ocean's 12. It's a slower film. It's almost like uh, you know, slower background score, and it's not frenetic, it's not chaotic in a way that some bits of Ocean's 12 can be. But I just love it's an adaptation of an O. Henry short story called The Last Leaf, and I think it's a lesson in how a story or a book can be adapted into a film. And I just love how much is kind of unsaid and how things are allowed to like unravel and play out in the film. And I also think there's a strong sense of plot in that film. Like you go again from point A to point B, the characters grow older. And again, the common thing I think that binds a lot of the stuff that I like and a lot of the stuff that I have a taste for is that it has a strong sense of place. Lutera, like the first bits are set in this estate, this feudal estate in Bengal, and then the second half is set in a hill station in Himachal Pradesh. So different seasons again, right? Like the second half is set in the winter, whereas the first half is set in like a spring summery kind of setting. So it's got a lot of elements that I enjoy in terms of locating a story in a place and time. Um, show. There's a show that I really loved called Mozart in the Jungle. It's on Amazon Prime, or at least it used to be. And it's Gael Garcia Bernal, who plays Che in Motorcycle Diaries, Che Guevara in Motorcycle Diaries. He plays a music conductor called Rodrigo, who moves from Mexico City to New York to lead the New York Symphony. And I found the concept itself so original. I found it unique. Uh, and the show is kind of about him navigating New York. He's this very passionate Latin man. And there are all these different characters who have their own kind of tracks going on, right? Like the oboe player and the drum, all like people who play different instruments, 5, 6 of them, you have their own tracks going on. And I love the way that it's all blended so beautifully into the show. And shout out to my friend Varsha, who introduced me to Mozart in the Jungle. And again, strong sense of place, right? They go to Mexico City to meet Rodrigo and his love interest, Haley, I think, who plays the oboe. Like he takes her to see his grandmother in Oaxaca in Mexico. And then they have an episode where they go and they do a concert in Japan. So the way they capture Japan. And then in the Japan episode, they use like a lot of thematic music, right? Like Japanese music. So that's how I discovered like Mari Asakawa, who's like who plays Japanese jazz and blues. So I love shows that do that with music, and uh, they help you discover new music, which you then go into different rabbit holes in, and it's integrated into the show in a very organic way. So that's and then there's a lovely episode with Monica Bellucci guest starring as La Fiamma, who's this very famous opera singer, and Rodrigo has to go to Venice. She lives in Venice to convince her to come back and do this one last show. Uh, so beautiful. Like I love how they uh, take these characters and put them in different settings. I think that's what I really enjoy. Uh, and then you said film, show, and a podcast.
Like a podcast or a music album, a musician, a podcast I'd recommend Barefoot Boys for sure. Like I feel like that's a great
Yeah,
podcast too.
I wish more people had heard Barefoot Boys though. I think it kind of came and went. We'd worked really hard over many months to put it out. And it took a village. It took about like 25 people working on this to produce this and stuff. So yeah, I definitely recommend that, people go and listen to Barefoot Boys. But another podcast that I used to Empire. Empire is something that I enjoy a lot. It's William Dalrymple and Anita Anand's history podcast. Uh, and what I really enjoy is also the dynamic that the two of them have as hosts. I think it's such a lesson in, it's such a lesson in chemistry, and like it's such a lesson in like how hosts can play off each other and their personalities in the course of like putting together a show. And they get these really interesting uh they get experts. Say they do an episode on the Persian Empire, they'll get an expert on like Persian history, and very specific kind of periods and people. And I love the way that they do it in a pretty like non-academic and a very like pop way. And I think some serious historians have a problem with that. So I don't know, maybe some of the factual stuff, maybe they take some liberties here and there, you know, uh, a little bit of poetic license here and there. But I think I take it all in the spirit of the show. Like I'm not looking at it as some kind of great reference that I would use while I'm working on a historical tome. Uh, I listen to it for how accessible and doing history in like in a pop way, with banter and with like jokes and things like that. So that's a podcast that I listen to, and I enjoy a lot. So maybe and I enjoy British humor. I enjoy like classic, old school British banter, and there's a lot of that on empire. So maybe that's what I would take to the desert island.
Fair, yeah, and I mean, if you want to add something about the music, are you like a music
Music,
music?
my music day, it's mostly I listen to a lot of Bollywood music, and I am a massive Arijit Singh fan.
Amazing.
Yeah. So one of my dream stories that I wanted to commission while we were at 52 was a profile of Arijit Singh. The singer, he's known to be like reclusive and doesn't
Yeah.
give too many interviews. I think he lives in Murshidabad. He spends a lot of the year in Murshidabad, which is where he's from in Bengal. So I just find him like a very interesting uh, person, like creatively also. I think he's also a trained musician, and a lot of musicians, when they talk about him like in terms of complete awe, and they say that he's not only just a singer who comes to the studio and just sings and goes, but he has a sense of notation and he's classically trained and all of that. So maybe I would compile a playlist of my favorite Arijit Singh songs and take it to the desert island.
How lovely. I think we got so many recommendations on this episode, Vikram. This was such a lovely chat. I really enjoyed it. I feel like there are so many more tangents I'd love to discuss with you, but I think that's for the listeners to explore through your writing and your other pieces. And but yeah, if someone does want to reach you on the internet, Vikram, I know you do a lot of freelance writing work in addition to your journalism and your fiction. So, what are some ways they can reach out to you and read some of your work on the internet?
So, I mean, there's my Substack. It's very unimaginatively named Vikram's Substack. So you can find me on Substack. You can find me on Twitter. I spend a lot of time on Twitter, for better or worse. My handle is at Vikram Shah 1991 1991. Um, and yeah, if you'd like to explore like opportunity, like to work together, or I do freelance sort of content consultancy, editing, writing, you can look up my LinkedIn, where I've listed the indicative list of the kind of projects that I've worked on. So you can reach me on LinkedIn too. Um, yeah, and you can find my work on Mint, on the Mint website. There's an author page with my name, Vikram Shah. So that's where you can find a lot of my work for Mint. And do check out 52.in, FIFTYTWO, spell out 52. There's about 110 amazing long form stories over there, many of which that I've edited, which cover various aspects of subcontinental life. There are sports stories, there are political stories, there are cultural stories. I worked on that for 3 years. Uh, and it was a team and a job, and a boss that I really enjoyed working with, and it was a dream job in so many ways for me. And we put our heart and soul in putting that publication out. And I mean, if I say so myself, there's quite nothing quite like it, I think, on the Indian internet. So do check out some of the work that we put out on 52.in. I'd love if you'd be.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Vikram. I will be including all the notes and the links in the show notes, so please do follow that. And until next time, this is Abhishek Shetty signing off on this episode of Learning Stories. Stay tuned for more such stories. I think the reason I created this podcast was really to create, as I said at the start, a kinder and more empathetic version of the internet. And I truly believe that it's the stories, the individual stories, and the journeys that really make our collective story. So I love this conversation with Vikram, and I'm excited to read other work by him. But until next time, keep learning. And this is Abhishek Shetty on this episode of Learning Stories. Thanks, Vikram.